I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second of two seminars that the bank is hosting at this year's Board of Governors meeting. At this seminar, we will distill the findings of our research on the green economy, and in particular on renewable energy. You will find copies of the research online. We have also provided flash drives with copies on them, and as well you can actually get printed copies if you so desire. The research is titled "A New Paradigm for Caribbean Development, Transitioning to a Green Economy." At this seminar, you will also hear from experts on the lessons and challenges with respect to transitioning to a green economy within the Caribbean. Now, this particular area of research came out of a desire to understand the further merits of renewable energy and the requirements for transforming and improving the competitiveness of our Caribbean economies. Now, to discuss this topic this morning, we have assembled a panel of 4 experts. We will hear perspectives from the state sector, private sector, and regional institutions. We have a distinguished panel here with us this morning. First of all, you will hear from Mr. Christopher Brown, Project Coordinator, Energy with the Development Bank of Jamaica. He will be giving a presentation on stimulating domestic private sector development in the renewable energy sector in Jamaica and the Caribbean. Next, we will hear from Mr. Ralph Busy Williams, founder and chairman of Williams Industries Incorporated of Barbados. His presentation will be entitled "Private Sector View of Renewable Energy Development, Experience in the Caribbean with a Focus on Barbados." Third, you will hear from Mr. Thomas Schultz, Director of the Caribbean Renewable Energy Development Program, CREDEP. His presentation will look at the overview of renewable energy development in the Caribbean over the next decade. And finally, you will hear from our very own Mr. Joseph Williams, Energy Policy Consultant with the Caribbean Development Bank, who will give you a regional perspective on renewable energy dimensions of the green economy. As with yesterday's seminar, this panel discussion will take the following format. Each presenter will be invited to give their presentation, and they will each have approximately 10 to 12 minutes in which to present. At the end of the final presentation, I will then open up the floor for questions and answers by you. I expect to run a tight ship because we're already running late after the late start of this seminar. But at the end of it, I will probably take 2 to 3 minutes to summarize the main points and conclusions coming out of the panel discussion this morning. Now, let me begin. I also have the additional task of, in addition to chairing this session, of presenting to you some of the key findings coming out of the research that the CDB has done over the last year on the green economy and transitioning to a new development paradigm. When we speak of the green economy, what are we speaking about? It's really interpreted here quite narrowly for this research as increases in energy efficiency and the use of renewable energy. So the document that we present to you this morning has a particular focus on renewable energy. It is that aspect of the green economy which we have focused on for today. Now, of course, when we speak of the green economy, we tend to focus on 3 critical elements. There's the economic aspect of it, so it's actually 3 pillars as it were, the social aspect, and the environmental sustainability of it. All of this can be seen within the context of the document and within the introduction. What is the rationale for Caribbean economies transitioning to a green economy? Within the study, 3 case studies were outlined. We looked in particular at the employment benefits of perhaps renewable energy, foreign exchange impacts of it, cost competitiveness or renewable energy alternatives, the environmental impact, the policy and institutional environment, and other barriers to perhaps investing in green technologies. Other issues relevant to the developing the sector have also been addressed. The first case study we looked at was was in Jamaica, the Wigton Wind Farm. Here, some of the key lessons that we distilled was that it was very important for there to be an appropriate policy and regulatory framework to guide the industry's development. An appropriate pricing policy was also important, and the policy framework and regulatory environment needed to be adaptable. We must also be cognizant of the fact that there needs to be a framework of understanding that the data tends to change over time, and we must be able to account for this within our cost, benefit, and assessment exercises. What are the requisite resources required for renewable energy? We need to have sufficient financial. The human aspect type of capital is also important for this type of exercise. And we need to also think about the efficient and effective policy and regulatory environment for the implementation of a green policy. The second case study which we looked at was actually in St. Lucia, and here we looked at the Sandals Latok Resort there. What were some of the key lessons learned? Here, I've put them up here. An appropriate policy and regulatory framework, again, came out as being particularly important for this particular case study. And I'm not going to go into much detail because I don't want to take too much time in presenting this. I actually want the panelists to give their presentation. So this is just to give you a quick overview of what some of the main findings were. Now, it's very important for us to understand that tourism is an important sector for the Caribbean. And so it becomes important for us to understand that the tourism industry needs to be included in any sort of renewable energy and energy efficiency policy formulation. Tourism and energy waste management policy for environment sustainability is also important, as well as access to finance. These were some of the key issues that came out of this particular case study. The third case study we looked at was, of course, the Williams Industries out of Barbados. And you will hear more about this from the presentation by Mr. Williams later on. But here are some of the key issues that came up as being lessons for us from that particular exercise. Let me just move along properly, quite quickly. Now, for green projects and renewable energy, assessing project outcomes is particularly important. And we now have to try to wrap our minds around how do we access renewable energy and green economy type projects. They do take us beyond the normal remit of cost-benefit analysis. We need to account for things like carbon. How do we actually price carbon within our assessments? And it was only earlier this week that the bank actually approved its first carbon finance initiative for a project in Belize. And really, it took us at the bank some understanding, as well as our investment partner, the European Investment Bank, to understand how do we actually go about assessing these types of particular projects. Now, when we looked at this particular exercise, we looked at the cost comparison of how does renewable energy compare to perhaps conventional sources of energy. Here we looked at the cost comparisons over time, and which indicates that although renewable energy, the capital component at first may be higher than conventional energy sources, because of there isn't much sort of maintenance and there isn't a flow of resources that needs to go into the renewable energy project, we find that over the whole life cost of the project, that in fact renewable energy actually does come out better than conventional sources of energy. However, if we were to look further and include the externalities and as well as the climate change impacts associated with all forms of energy, we find that renewable sources of energy throughout the assessment actually comes out even better than conventional forms. So if we account for example, the cost of carbon that may come from conventional forms of fossil fuel energy sources as compared to renewable energy. So if we were to include this all within our cost-benefit analysis, we find that the whole cost-life approach of looking at these particular new forms of energy, the results are even better for renewable energy, as it were. So what were some of the... here are some of the selected recommendations coming out of the report. For the Caribbean, too often we have focused on climate change adaptation, as it were. For us to actually have a very good renewable energy policy, we need to also now focus on climate change mitigation, as it were. How do we reduce the levels of carbon coming out from our industries, from our production and consumption activities? Although we do not emit much carbon in terms of the relative to the global total, if we were to focus on this could actually be a very good conduit for us to have investment within renewable energy. We need to ensure that there's a stable policy environment for renewable energy. And thirdly, we need to ensure that there's a strengthening of the intersectoral linkages between renewable energy development and the rest of the economy, so that we ensure that the multiplier effect is much wider throughout. We also need to look at the different funding sources, the disparate sources of funding for renewable energy. How can we actually amalgamate this all into a pot to help us address perhaps both national and regional renewable energy initiatives? Oops. Now, we should also focus on using market-based instruments to encourage the use of energy efficiency technologies within our homes and businesses, and integrate renewable energy and greening into building design, architecture, and perhaps building codes. The whole area of statistics and data, we need to look at this, for we need to have the data to allow us to make accurate assessments as to the feasibility of using renewable energy and green technologies within our economic structures. Assess the scale at which renewable energy can be accommodated on the electric utility grid. And we need to find some way, again, and I re-emphasize this, of pooling resources, finding the resources, pulling them all together in a way where we can actually focus them on renewable energy and green energy initiatives. So that's the end of a very quick wrap-up of the major findings of the research which we have done at the Caribbean Development Bank. And without further ado, I would like to invite our first presenter to come to give his presentation, Mr. Christopher Brown.
Thank you, Justin. Governors of CDB, directors of CDB, guests of CDB, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank CDB for inviting me here to share my experience in energy efficiency in the private sector in Jamaica. This is my first time to Guyana, and from what I've seen so far, it's a beautiful country. I wish I could get some more time. I wish I could get some more time to actually visit more sites. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and do this as quickly as possible. I am representing the Development Bank of Jamaica, which is a wholly owned government institution mandated to foster economic development and growth in Jamaica. The current energy situation in Jamaica, like most CARICOM countries, is heavily dependent on the importation of fuel. Unfortunately, in Jamaica, our energy prices are 42 cents per kilowatt hour, and this affects the industrial competitiveness of our SMEs and businesses. As a national directive, the Development Bank of Jamaica was mandated to step in. And in 2008, we established an energy fund, which got very little uptake. By 2010, we established a project with the Inter-American Development Bank to promote energy efficiency and renewable energy among SMEs in Jamaica. And as you can see by the graph, our loan interest has grown drastically over the past 3 years. In 2010, it was 174 million Jamaican, and up to last year, it went up to 600 Jamaican million. The DBJ's involvement in energy is guided by our national energy policy, which aims to reduce the importation of oil into Jamaica. DBJ's involvement is in energy efficiency within the industrial sectors. On the electricity supply side, we would facilitate new constructions, the improvement of existing generation technology. On the demand side, we'll speak to energy efficiency, renewable energy, both in the private sector and the public sector. And then we have doubled a bit in household energy efficiency. There are 3 main pillars in DBJ's energy strategy. First being to attract funding from our international and regional partners in loans or technical assistance programs. The second pillar being financing solutions to try and create the appropriate financing mechanisms to facilitate investment in energy efficiency and renewable energy. And then the third pillar, which may be the most important, is technical assistance and capacity building programs, which yesterday we spoke a lot about building the human capital. I think this is a key area in trying to bring the 3 pillars together. In 2010, we did a study amongst SMEs, and it revealed that 70% of the SMEs did not know how to define energy efficiency or renewable energy, or what either was. And I think it's unfair for us to want to facilitate investments in energy with people who are unaware in what energy is. So the DBJ has come up with a term we could call it an energy ecosystem, which speaks to 4 main subsectors or pieces of the puzzle that we think are integral in facilitating sustainable energy. The first being energy audits. It is important that assessments are done before projects are designed, and we have partnered with an institution to develop a training curriculum for certified energy managers in Jamaica. So these are energy auditors who will be able to assess and provide recommendations for energy projects. This certification will allow them to maintain a certain standard, a standard that can be acceptable to banks to facilitate or to finance these projects. The second piece is that of public education. We have utilized demonstration projects to showcase the benefits of actual implementation in energy and energy efficiency and renewable energy. We have maintained a strong marketing presence, and we have done a number of capacity building initiatives, workshops with the three main stakeholders. That would be the financial institutions, the businesses themselves, and the suppliers. Because at the end of the day, they all need to be speaking the same language. The third, which is often omitted, is that of energy management. Now, I heard something yesterday regarding the management of projects, and I think it is critical for energy as well. Oftentimes, projects are designed, implemented, and left alone, and that doesn't facilitate any form of sustainability. Energy management carries it after the execution to the completion of the life of the project. There are certain standards. An example is that of the ISO 50001, which is an energy management standard, which I think should be built into all energy projects. In the case of Japan, they have embedded energy management in their law. So for entities who utilize over a threshold of energy, they must hire at least one energy manager. And that is by law. So they're ensuring that the efficient management is done throughout the life, whether it is an energy project or just throughout operations. Just some information on DBJ's energy fund. We have funded over 10 million US in energy efficiency and renewable energy. since 2008. Based on the graph I showed you, you can realize the bulk of that has come in the past 3 years when we started our ecosystem approach. These loans have been supported by guarantee funds and grants. The guarantee fund, we provide up to 50% of the loan amount with a maximum of $100,000. And we also offer energy audit grants to conduct energy audits. So to ensure that the feasibility aspect is dealt with first, we will facilitate that through grants. I just want to touch briefly on investments in the private sector in Jamaica, some examples. We did 7 demonstration projects in 4 sectors: agriculture, tourism, services, and agro-processing. And these projects consisted of loan funding as well as grant funding. In some cases, the grant funding was as high as 70% and as low as 30%. I would suggest, and I think it would be a lesson learned from these projects, that grant funding is not done so high because the companies become dependent on the funding. Let me give you an example. We did a project in an agro-processing facility which changed air conditioning units, changed their tariff, so that's the rate that they operate from the utility company, power factor correction, boiler maintenance, for a cost of $20,000. And this is a live project. In the analysis that we did this year, which captured the last 2 years of the entity, they have been able to save $50,000 per year from this intervention. So that's a return on investment within a year. And I'm not saying that all projects will be as attractive as this one, but we have used this as a demonstration to highlight what is possible. And not what is possible based on studies, but what is possible based on actual results. The next thing I want to touch on is investments in the public sector. And we're presently working with the European Union to create a structure for the private sector to invest in the public sector through the development of an ESCO industry. So an ESCO is an energy services company. And what they do is they provide energy solutions from the design of the project, the implementation of the project, as well as the financing of the project. And what ESCOs will do is they fund the projects and are paid from the savings that are realized from the projects. So our approach is to try and see how best we can facilitate the ESCO industry within the public sector, possibly through PPPs. We spoke on PPPs yesterday, so I don't need to get into it too detailed. But the targeted institutions would be public buildings such as schools, hospitals, ministries. In Jamaica, we have a present interest by the private sector in going into the schools. So we're thinking about possibly grouping 5 or 10 schools together, find the correct PPP arrangement or structure, and then facilitate that. There are some key elements which need to be dealt with first before ESCOs can be facilitated. And that is the legislative and the regulatory framework, which the project we're presently doing with the European Union is addressing. Building the capacity of the ESCOs themselves. They need to be able to prepare bankable projects or prepare projects that bankers can understand. That's one of the biggest gaps we have found. The technical aspect is much different from the financing aspect, and there is nobody who has been able to bridge the gap as effectively as they should. That leads me to the next aspect, which is strengthening the financial institution so that they can understand how to assess these energy projects. And then finally, creating the suitable loan product that could be utilized by these ESCOs in the public sector. Could be something supported by guarantees by the government, grants. I guess that's something to be determined. Just to speak on the roles of the government and the private sector in the ESCO model, and this is proposed, the government would provide assets, land or building. So in this example, let us say it is provide the school for the private entity to invest. The government may also make small investments, such as fixing windows, fixing the building envelope. And this is to ensure that whatever renewable energy or energy efficiency investment made by the private sector can be sustainable or can be efficient. No private sector entity would want to change air conditioning units in a school where the windows are broken. And then the other thing the government could do is provide collateral guarantees. Possible. It may not have to be 100%. It could be 20% to kind of spur and facilitate the investment. On the private sector side, they'll be invested in the high capital technology. Solar panels, wind turbines, air conditioning units, lighting systems, whatever the case may be. And their role would also be to operate and maintain the project. Again, yesterday they spoke on the operation and maintenance, which promotes PPP investments. And then finally, the private sector would be the owners of the project. And making them the owner, I believe, would cause the projects to be more efficiently carried out because they are driven by profit at the end of the day. The benefits, so these two entities would come together and create an energy project, and the benefits to the government would be they would realize savings without making high capital investment. It reduces the investment risk to the government. On the private sector side, they are driven by profits, so profits must be a benefit to them, as well as, and probably more importantly, they'll be able to develop a track record in implementing these projects. One of the challenges we have realized is energy companies are unable to access financing from the banks because the work that they have done is not proven. They don't have a track record. So that's the structure. Just some lessons learned before I wrap up. The national energy policy or energy efficiency law is important in facilitating private sector investment in energy. The energy projects should include energy efficiency and not just focus on renewable energy. Energy management, again, I won't stress it enough, is an integral part of any project because it facilitates sustainability. The ESCOs, they can reduce the investment risk to the government on these public sector projects. And last thing I'll say is when doing energy projects, and this is something that we have proven, energy efficiency projects give a payback of within 3 years. Renewable energy projects average around 7 years. But probably the best project is one that is coupled, energy efficiency and renewable energy, which can give a payback of 5 years. I hope my presentation was insightful. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Christopher. Very insightful presentation. Now I'll invite Mr. Ralph Busy Williams to the podium to give us his presentation.
Good morning, governors and other delegates and presenters. It's a pleasure for me to be in Guyana once again. I've been coming here for the last 40 years, quite often to get beaten by the Guyanese racing drivers, but on occasion we have won. One of my first businesses was actually in building racing cars, so I'm kind of techie. Now, today I've come not to speak about theoretical stuff, but to speak about actual experience in the business and having been involved in solar for over 25 years. When solar was not everybody's interest, I started to use it to provide electricity on board of sailing boats. And we ran a big fleet of catamaran sailboats, and we installed solar, and it worked great. Problem is it was too expensive. So, and let me see, I got some instructions on how to work this there. Yeah. Now, let me see. First slide here is now, our company, Williams Industries, owns Williams Solar, which is a separate company specifically created to develop alternative energy projects. Williams Solar has installed about 1.4 megawatts on our own buildings and about 600 kilowatts on other people's buildings since about 3 years ago. I think the 600 kilowatts has been exceeded now since I wrote this. It's now more like 1,000 kilowatts, like another megawatt. The work that we have done in Barbados and in St. Lucia is equivalent to, we're producing as much electricity from solar as all of the other providers or installers combined, including the government. How do we get that? Since July 2012, we have generated over 3 million kilowatt hours for ourselves from the sun. Without restrictions, in my opinion, these figures could be more than doubled. And when I'm talking about restrictions, the Barbados Light and Power introduced a rider system where they first allowed people to install solar up to 5 kilowatts on private residents and up to 50 kilowatts for commercial. We immediately jumped on it and installed a 28 kilowatt system for testing because I didn't want to get heavily involved without knowing the facts. Nobody else seemed to be too interested. Once we got the data from the 28 kilowatt system, we moved pretty quickly. My colleague over in the back there, David Staples, American, he has contacts all over the world, so he managed to persuade the XM Bank in the United States to finance a project for us through the PNC Bank. And unfortunately, there were no regulations in place which would guarantee the output. So, or the rate that you would be paid for the solar, for the power. So we had to finance this on the strength of the Williams Industries balance sheet, which I know a lot of companies in the Caribbean would not be able to do. But we were able to do it, and he financed it at 4%. So we went ahead, and by that time, the Barbados Light and Power had agreed to change the maximum allowed on a commercial installation to 150 kilowatts. When they saw how rapidly we were installing systems, I think they got a little bit concerned about depreciation or reduction in their business. So they put a few, they'd smile nicely to you and so on, but take a long time to install meters and that sort of thing. And we still managed to achieve the 1.2 megawatts quickly, but we could not draw down on all of the finance that we negotiated because we were being blocked constantly, and there was a time limit on which you could draw the thing, which is a pity really, because we could have twice as much installed now if we were given a free hand to do it. What we have, I'll just show you some of the projects that I've been an advocate of alternative energy now for as long as I can remember, because it makes sense. That wind turbine there is the first one ever erected in Barbados for commercial use. That's just a 40 kilowatt, but that was 25 years ago. And I didn't realize you needed permission. So we had to take it down in 5 years. We managed to keep it running for 5 years. But, and so that was my first major thing in producing energy from alternative. Since then, we have tried our best to get permissions in Barbados to erect much larger wind turbines, and we have never been able to get it. I will tell you a joke, but I don't know if this is the right forum to tell the joke, but they had a town hall meeting. You're required to have town hall meetings in Barbados when you want to do something like this. And they had a town hall meeting in the parish of St. Lucie, which is the best wind parish in Barbados. And people assembled, and the project was presented and so on. And there was a gentleman who got up and said he was absolutely sure he had evidence that wind turbines would render men impotent. Now, this is in the same parish where a gentleman called Mr. Ward had lived when Barbados' whole economy was driven by wind turbines. And Mr. Ward produced over 100 children. So I think that debunked his theory. But still, we can't get permission. So let me see if I can get this thing to work. Yeah. These are some of the projects that we have completed. That's a 150 kilowatt system on one of our buildings. This is another one, another 150 kilowatt on a hardware store. This one is we operate the only and the largest desalination plant in Barbados, and we sell water to the government. This has been in operation now for about 15 years, very successfully. And we decided this year that we would try to reduce the cost of the electricity, which is a major element of the cost. So we covered the building with photovoltaics, but then we went and did the cardinal sin of installing ground-mounted solar there to on land that was all belonging to the same plant. It was nothing. It was never doing anything else. And we got a very dirty letter, well, a strong letter from the town planning department demanding that we either apply for permission to put it there immediately, or we might have to remove it. So regulations and so on, this is what we consider to be ridiculous. But in the case in Barbados too, where you're trying to install solar in areas designated to be agricultural land, the argument now that I'm using is that the plants convert sunlight into energy and to food and so on, and we're doing the same with solar. But the town planning, chief town planner is not buying the argument just yet. But this is another installation here on a new office tower that we. Oh boy, this thing is something else. Yeah, that's on the roof of an office tower. That one is another. I think it's about 100 kilowatts because that's all that we could get on the building. This one here is on one of our malls. You will see 150 kilowatts of solar there. A pity I didn't have a pointer. But the one on the bottom of the screen is 150 kilowatts. On the top of the screen, you'll see a black area. That is the remainder of the roof of the mall, or part of it. Now, that roof could carry 350 kilowatts quite easily. If the solar is installed, it would shade the roof from the sun and reduce the air conditioning load considerably on the roof. It's the heat thing. But they wouldn't let us install more than 150 kilowatts, and it makes no sense at all to me. But that's what we're trying our best to get these barriers removed. This particular building in the mall, the demand is 1,100 kilowatts. So what? And my argument to the utility is, suppose the main breaker tripped, would it destabilize your grid? The answer is no. So why not let me put 350 kilowatts on it, and if the sun comes over and it drops to 150 kilowatts, what difference does it make? You know, it doesn't make sense what is being the barriers that are being put in place. This is a typical installation. Whoa, this thing, no, that is a typical inverter. Whoa, this thing is a piece of kit, boy. I now see why the Jamaican man was getting in trouble. I thought he was just nervous. The banker there. Yeah, this is a typical inverter installation for a 150 kilowatt system. And and this is what is required for you have to have a external disconnect and so on, and big swines, so that if the utility wants, they can come and disconnect you anytime if they're working on their grid and they don't want to get shot by your power coming back into the grid. So, and the meter, all of the electricity generated from our systems is metered, and in some cases we operate on a buy all sell all arrangement, and in other cases we operate on net metering. These is some arguments in favor of solar. It's a competitive substitute for daytime peak power. It costs approximately $2,500 US per peak kilowatt installed. The price has dropped since then, since I wrote this. It's pretty fierce competition in the market in Barbados now. Each peak kilowatt produces about 4.5 to 5 kilowatt hours per day, or 1642 to 1825 kilowatt hours per annum. Fuel savings, about 410 to 465 US dollars per peak kilowatt, and that is straight saving in foreign exchange for the imported oil. And the value of the electricity is about 451 to what is it, 510. So the return on capital is about 13 to 16%. Payback period 5 years. Free electricity for the next 20 years. What could make more sense? Has no impact on the environment whatsoever. So I can't think, apart from the appearance, but I don't think it is an unattractive thing to have solar in a field. And so we think it's going to be something that you're going to find in the future, whether the regulators and the Light and Power likes it or not. What I believe the regulators need to do, commercial customers need to be allowed to put enough PV on their roof to provide all the kilowatt hours that they use. In Barbados, the regulators allow the Barbados Light and Power to change the demand charge from $3 per kVA of demand to 23 or 24, I think it is, per kVA of demand. So that's what they get. The PV does not reduce your demand significantly, because on a morning when all the air conditioning starts up, you usually get your peak demand anyhow. So you will still have to pay the $24 per kVA of demand. So the Light and Power gets that whether they produce any electricity or not. And the PV power will then produce all of the power that the customer uses. Admittedly, on a morning, you'll be receiving power from the utility at midday, and from 10 to 2 or 2:30, you'll be feeding power back to the utility, and the net result is zero. My feeling is that some of the biggest users of electricity throughout the Caribbean are the water authorities. They use a tremendous amount of electricity to pump water to customers all over the Caribbean. My thinking is, why not use PV? The problem with PV is it only produces power during the day, of course, and more so in the middle of the day. So why not install enough PV to pump the water and store the energy, pump the water to elevated reservoirs where it will be stored as kinetic energy, and then feed it by gravity to the customers during the nighttime periods and when the PV is not operating. So it's an excellent energy storage mechanism for the Caribbean, in my opinion. I flying over Guyana here yesterday. Lots of flat areas And you could easily have those elevated reservoirs that you see in the United States, where you can pump water to and then gravity feed at night. In my opinion, government should mandate the water authorities to reduce the electricity purchase from the grid by 50% within 5 years. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing, and I know we have evaluated what can be done, and I'm not talking about theoretical stuff. We've done the sums, and it's achievable. It's achievable. Utilities should be mandated to reduce to produce or buy from taking too long. Independent power producers 10% of all the electricity that they sell. Let's get back here. Oh dear. No, this, you gotta give me some more time. This thing is double boxing. I'll give you an example of Barbados. You asked me to focus on Barbados. It's about, this slide tells it all. 1% of the land area of Barbados can produce all the power that Barbados consumes from PV. So I believe that the grid in Barbados can accommodate at least 30 megawatts of PV installations, and we should be allowing it to happen. It will not destabilize the grid in our opinion, but the utility companies, it is not in their best interest to agree with me, because they want to continue selling electricity, and to prove it, the utility in Barbados has now put out a tender for an 8 megawatt system. Now, just to demonstrate to whoever's here that I'm a real believer in reducing carbon and utilizing alternative energy, this is my mode of transportation. It is an all-electric vehicle, which is one of the nicest vehicles I've ever had to drive. We charge it from that little charger on the thing which is connected to the photovoltaic panels on the roof, and I drive free. Well, sort of free, because we had to buy the photovoltaic panels. But I would strongly recommend this to anybody, and furthermore, the development that's being done now in battery technology is amazing, and in my opinion, about 10 years from now, I believe the utilities might actually become obsolete. From the time you can store PV power in batteries at a competitive price, you're really looking at changing the world. In my opinion, the whole Caribbean could be powered by the sun. Thank you all very much indeed. I'm sorry to have run off.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. Now I'll ask Mr. Thomas Schultz to come and give his presentation.
Governors and directors of the CDB, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning. It's a great pleasure for me and an honor to be invited by the CDB to be part of this panel discussion about green economy. I would like to congratulate the CDB as well for having constructed this study about green economy that adds interesting aspects and findings on the ongoing discussion on green economy and its implications. I'm speaking on behalf of the Caribbean Renewable Energy Development Program, which is implemented by the German Agency for International Cooperation, GIZ, and financed by the German government with co-financing from the European Union and the Austrian government. The tasks to secure a reliable and sustainable energy future for the Caribbean region are complex and challenging. I would like to invite you to accompany me on a journey into the year 2025, when the burning tasks in the energy sector are solved or on its irrecoverable way. Let's assume we all did our homework very well and look backwards what has been achieved about 10 years from now in changing the energy landscape. And here are some top 10 energy issues that needs to be addressed and solved. As you can see, this list is possibly not exhaustive, but I think this lists most of the problems that has to be addressed and solved for the next 10 years to come. I'm going through not all one by one, but will concentrate on the most important issues under each of these topics. Sorry, it's a bit sensitive. Yeah, okay. Under the heading of regional energy policies and energy sector regulation, which is one of the most important and burning issues for the region. Regional energy policies, the regional energy policy, which was adopted and endorsed by the heads of government in 2030, will be implemented throughout the CARICOM region in the year 2025. CSERMs, which is the sustainable part of the regional energy, will be implemented in most of the CARICOM countries, member states. ESERA, which is presently underway or being set up right now, which is the Eastern Caribbean Energy Regulatory Authority, will finally be operational, and hopefully, and that's what we assume, in 2018, Antigua and Barbuda and St. Kitts and Nevis may have joined, and also Dominica and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which at the moment have no interest in joining ESERA right now. Finally, national energy policies are implemented, and the Energy Supply Acts amended in about 80% of the CARICOM member states. Government expenditures for importing fossil fuels have been reduced by 30% within the next 10 years. When it comes to Caribbean energy mix, at the moment the region is depending in the range of about 90% from fossil fuel imports. In 2025, we will have achieved a reduction from 90% to about 60% on dependency of fossil fuel. We have no illusion that the region will be completely fossil-free within the next 10 years. We have to be realistic. It will still take a while before the region can really become independent, if at all. Renewable energies contribute in about 10 years 20 to 50% at national level, and about 30%, which is quite a conservative estimate, as an average throughout the CARICOM region. As we said before, water utilities, I just take up this point from my former presenters, water utilities need to generate their own electricity in order to reduce their electricity cost. Our estimate is 20% can easily be achieved by using hydro or PV. We have already first attempts to do so in Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, maybe Grenada. When it comes to renewable energy, Okay. When it comes to renewable energy, wind parks, which are currently under preparation, will have been installed in 10 years and operated by utilities or by independent power producers. We have first attempts to do so in St. Lucia right now, in Grenada, in Antigua and Barbuda. We know the experience already in Jamaica. That is already history over the last 20 years. PV plants at utility scale will be installed. Utilities will use PV plants at large scale in the megawatt range. And in about 50% of the CARICOM countries, PV plants will be operational. Hydropower, the region has more potential than one would think. There are already hydropower in use right now in St. Vincent and in Dominica, but there are more untapped potential, of course. In Guyana, we heard that in Suriname they are using it already, but also in small islands like in St. Vincent. We prepared almost 10 already documents to install a second hydro in St. Vincent, fourth hydro in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for instance. We have a project prepared in Dominica. And in St. Lucia, it's presently underway to plan for a small hydro in combination with the John Compton Dam. Amaila Falls in Guyana, it's on the agenda since about 10 years, and now it seems to be close to realization. So all this will be done in 10 years. We assume that we see a different landscape in using renewable energies throughout the region. Biomass from forest and agricultural residues are in abundance, but not used as yet in Guyana and Suriname and Belize and others. 4, energy efficiency, energy intensity. intensity. Energy efficiency was largely underestimated. Actually, energy efficiency and mobilizing energy saving potential should be the first step before we think of renewable energies. In the past, many programs, including ours, thought first we need to go for renewable energy before we got the mandate also to look into energy efficiency. But I think we can say that the region is in infantile stage in using all and mobilizing all the energy saving potentials we have. Peak loads in 2025, we expect that peak loads are reduced at least 20% based on energy saving through different measures. That is a special topic. Hotels, they will not be longer allowed to pass on their electricity cost on to tourists. That's what they do today. In many cases, in many countries of the Caribbean, they do that. Streetlights for public lighting, they have a huge potential of saving the government's expenditure in electricity, up to 70% if all the streetlights would be changed to LED. 60% we expect that public buildings, if they are retrofitted, can be saved by, which is used right now in public buildings by lighting and air conditioning. Small and medium enterprises will have reduced their electricity bill in relative terms by 30%, implementing energy efficiency measures. Retailers who retail at the moment in the Caribbean, whatever they can find on the market without being obliged to use energy labels, they will be obliged to import only labeled equipment. That means internationally recognized energy labels that provide that these imported equipment is energy efficient. And finally, the energy intensity will be reduced by at least 20% throughout the entire region. When it comes to transport, in the meantime, the energy need for transport has taken over and is higher than the need for electricity generation in most of the countries. But it's not largely addressed as yet. Countries import whatever they can in used cars and congesting the roads, and that is a huge problem that needs urgently to be addressed. We would expect that electric and hybrid vehicles in 10 years will have been increased by at least 20%. Import duties should be, for conventional vehicles, should be guided by fuel consumption and emissions and no longer by other criteria. There also is a need for a strict system of technical inspections and sanctions, but this needs to be enforced, otherwise it will be useless in order to keep a fleet modernized with a reasonable fuel consumption. LIAT's fleet is to be modernized. Ferry boats, we need connections throughout the Caribbean. All these ferry boats are not available apart from the northern part of the Caribbean, and there's a huge need and also a huge potential for it. Finally, the import of fossil fuel for transport should be reduced by at least 30% in about 10 years. Electric utilities and their monopolies. In about 10 years from now, or looking back from 25, we expect that the utilities, of course, will still enjoy a reliable and regulatory environment. They will still have monopolies because these monopolies are guaranteed for the next decades to come. But they will most probably have the monopoly only on generation based on fossil fuel, on transmission, distribution, and sale, but no longer on renewable energies. They may face competition from independent power producers, and we see right now processes going on in St. Lucia, for instance, has publicly announced that this year they will break the monopoly of the utility in the case of renewable energy generation. The monopoly for the rest will stay on, but for renewable energy it will be allowed competition from independent power producers. That does not necessarily mean that they are not allowed to participate in generation based on renewable energy, but they have to accept IPPs. They will be acting as single buyers from independent power producers. And in 10 years, we expect that the electricity will be traded within the islands. We firmly believe that in the long run, maybe not even 10 years, but in 20 years, in the long run, a sustainable energy future of the Caribbean will only be secured if we manage to get inter-island connections. Think of the geothermal resources, for instance. It will be not possible to exploit them economically if they are not exported or exchanged between the islands. Simply the capacities that can be used by geothermal are too small to exploit it just on island level. So interconnections is a topic that needs to be addressed. And finally, also it will have to be allowed distributed generation by end users. We know that the utilities have their problem with it, but the pressure from the public and from individual users are high, and we have to find ways, and the utilities have to accept that they allow distributed generation and co-generation by large consumers. This will also finally help to increase supply security. Financing of investments, development banks and commercial banks offer loans. The CDB implemented successfully its energy policy, in brackets, which are being developed right now, and increased stepwise its lending volume to $30 or more million per year just for energy. The partner banks of the CDB and the CDB support what they are doing already right now, but it might much more intensively small and medium enterprises, and it operates sustainable also a energy investment portal for potential investors. The institutional landscape will have been changed. The energy unit of the CARICOM Secretariat provides a one-stop clearinghouse function for energy information and cooperate with development partners. Energy departments in the ministries fulfill their mandates. The function of the Energy Agency, which is presently or currently under discussion, will have been integrated in existing Caribbean institutions, including the CDB. And the cooperation between the regional institutions will have significantly be improved. Public awareness, which is a key issue. In 10 years, it will have been increased tremendously, significantly. School, colleges offer courses related related topics and courses in their curricula. Industrial enterprise seek increasingly advice based on an increased awareness about the benefits of renewable energy. And finally, energy capacity development. Development partners increasingly their regional energy expert or use of experts out from the region that are capacious and qualified to fulfill the functions of energy experts. Several Caribbean ESCOs will be established. Development banks and commercial banks are able to identify, prepare, and judge investment projects on their own. And technical community colleges and universities offer the full spectrum of academic education in renewable energy and energy efficiency. That is a vision which we have to do in 5 years. But we are hopeful and we are confident that the glass is half full rather than half empty. So we are confident it can be achieved if we all do our homework well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for that presentation, giving us, I guess, a forecast of what we could possibly expect in the future. Now, this actually leads us very nicely into Mr. Joseph Williams' presentation, as he gives us an overview of critical policy issues in renewable energy for the Caribbean.
Governors, specially invited guests, colleagues of the Caribbean Development Bank, good morning. Just want to thank the other presenters for setting the stage for what I have to say very briefly, and I won't try to repeat what they have said in any way, well, hopefully. But I think it's important to understand the context of the discussion on renewable energy. And sometimes the context gets a little lost and the issues then become a little more challenging to grapple with. So what I want to do at the onset is just to put in context, well, a little widen the context a bit about in respect to the discussion on renewable energy here. I think the President did a very good job in establishing the why it's important as a region, as BMCs, for us to really maximize the opportunities that we have in the area of renewable energy and energy efficiency. As you know, energy efficiency is very important because it improves the productivity in terms of the investment for renewable energy, among other things. So we understand the critical importance of renewable energy for the objective of diversification of the energy supply situation, increase affordability over the long haul, the whole issue of sustainability, the environmental sustainability, lowering the carbon footprint, and so on. And very important, I think even hydrocarbon-rich territories, Suriname, Trinidad, have come around fully to understand the critical importance of this, so much so that they have seen it necessary to pursue or to have the pursuit of renewable energy development as a critical part of their energy policy landscape. Because it doesn't, it is important to know what your carbon footprint is, what your carbon intensity is globally. So, enough said. So we understand the basic rationale for the intervention or the need to ramp up the intervention in this area. What I think is sometimes less understood is how disruptive renewable energy is in terms of as an intervention. What we're talking about here is an opportunity for countries that were hitherto considered to be not endowed at all with energy resources, all of a sudden are now recognize that they are endowed. They have resources that they can use to their advantages. So that changes the landscape, and we're not just talking about the Caribbean, but globally. And so it's a new kind of conversation that's beginning to happen. The issue of treating with a number of development challenges. We talk about poverty, the energy poverty gender link. These are issues that renewable energy allow us now to begin to address in a very significant way. When we talk about the rural communities, the issue of energy and the disproportionate burden on the female part of the population, I mean, renewable energy provides almost a neat solution to address some of these, whereas the traditional forms will not be able to. So it's not just a question about treating with energy security or bringing in some fuel to substitute for fossil fuel. I'm just saying it's a wider discussion that we are engaged in. The whole question of democratization of the power supply. Hitherto, power production is considered to be in the realm of large corporation in the context of central general production and transmission and distribution. What you have now is a possibility for a small householder, a small business, to now be able to have control over its power. And so it's not just a question of changing one source to the other. There are a number of issues that impact development that we're talking about. And so when we get down to the policy issues, sometimes it's not very clear and evident to persons involved in the discussion that these are some of the things that are at the heart of the discussion and why the policy issues are so difficult to navigate. And so I thought it's important to understand that, because when you understand the stakes that are there, then we understand the posture of the utility. What we're talking about is a possible complete model, new model to the business. I mean, stranded assets discussion is a real discussion in some territories where there are significant opportunities. So I thought I would put that in there because the rest of it becomes a little easier to navigate when we understand some of the underlying issues. I thought I would have learned from the experiences. Okay, so for us as a region, green economy is yet another vehicle that can help us to move in the direction in which we want to go. You know, some people talk about low carbon strategy and so on. All of these, I think, as a region, we need to see as vehicles that can help us to move to achieve the kinds of maximization of the resources that we have. I really thought that these gentlemen couldn't use this thing. Okay, there are some, when we talk about a regional approach, there are some negatives for us because, one, there is not really a global consensus on this green economy. So that limits, when I say consensus, in terms of what it means, what is defined to be in the different contexts. And so that limits the utility of this vehicle, and we need to understand that. Also, from a regional standpoint, I don't think there is a regional consensus. The outcome from the Rio process was quite weak. But in spite of that, the fact that we have agreed as a region generally on the importance of renewable energy, I think we can make this work for us, utilizing this vehicle of the green economy. From a regional perspective, the real value add has to be what we can do collectively will buy us more than what we can do individually as BMC. I mean, that is really the question we have to grapple with if we are thinking about a regional approach. Obviously, the challenge for the regional approach is that the implementation mechanism in terms of the outfit that we have is fairly weak. And so even though we may agree regionally on some things, it still presents a challenge for us to move to implementation. So yes, I think there's scope for a regional approach. Yes, I think the regional institutions have a significant role generally, but there still remain challenges because of inherent weaknesses in the approaches that we have working with to date. What I would say is, from the standpoint of the development bank, there are opportunities in terms of capacity support, certainly because we're talking about an area that is relatively new. Even though we're in the business of power generation for years, there are some features, there are some dimensions of renewable energy and energy efficiency that are new to in our context, and it will require significant increase in capacity as well as some new learning. There is significant opportunity for incentivizing the decision-making process. So the whole question of providing incentives through innovative financing mechanism is a big opportunity for institutions like the development, like CDB. The whole question of coordinating in terms of establishing regional projects towards getting critical size projects. The whole issue of being desperate territories separated by sea is a real one. And so there is need for coordinating with the financing to support such efforts. What I call the need for structured policy dialogue is a critical one. And this is where it becomes very, very important in helping to clarify some of the issues. The stakeholders in this game, as you recognize by now, are the big stakeholders. We have the utilities, we have the governments, consumers, and we have potential investors. The utilities are faced with a situation where the business model is being pressured in traditional business model. And so the arguments that are put forward are understandable. But I think there is a need for significant analyses and information to clarify some of these issues. And I give you an example. The utilities will tell you that the grid cannot undertake more than 10% or 15% of intermittent or variable type energy, renewable energy, for example. But the truth is, for you to understand that, you need to do a study. You need to do a grid stability study to understand the dynamics of the technology, or that will impact the system. Most time, that's not done. Nobody knows. And so the utilities, being the default authority on this matter, their views prevail. I use it as an example to say that there is need for these kinds of analyses to clarify the kind of dialogue, to begin to look at the options and the scenarios that are really feasible. Similarly, for the governments who have a stake, significant stake, because there's a significant tax stake from energy, revenue, should I say. And so, what will be the impact of certain interventions? We really don't know in some territories. There's not a generic discussion. It requires an analytical look within the different territories. And so there is need for a coupling of that kind of technical analysis and support coupled with the kind of innovative financing instruments that can make things happen. And so there's significant opportunity there, I think, for intervention. By now, you would have recognized I'm not following my slide presentation, but you'll have it. And the whole question of de-risking some of these energy intervention is critical, and this is where entities like the CDB will be able to make a big difference going forward. I will just use another couple of minutes just to quickly identify broadly where I believe there are some significant opportunities. What I have there is just a list showing the peak demand. The coincident peak demand for the region is somewhere about 2,300 to 2,500 megawatts. For some of the territories, they have significant potential if they are able to develop their resources to move to the state where they can have excess renewable energy generation. So we have, like the Eastern Caribbean, it's possible within a few years, medium term, to have excess energy from that territory. Territories like Guyana, Suriname, and so on. As a region as a whole, I think it's not practical to think that we will be able to meet the total need for our electricity sector in the medium term, or maybe in the long term. But the fact is that there's a big opportunity to maximize the use of what we have, and I think that is where the emphasis is. How can we make sure we make use of what is possibly, quote unquote, free energy? That is the issue, and displace the high cost that we have to grapple with. There is, in terms of the size of the industry, using a peak demand of 2,500 megawatt, and if you use a load factor somewhere about, let's use 50%. We're looking, using 35 cents average, we could be looking at about $3.8 billion in terms of revenue, just using that as a basic metric. And if you look at the fuel cost, which is somewhere about 50% in some case, you could be looking at $1.9 to $2 billion or $2.85 billion in terms of displaced fuel costs from the electricity sector. So that is not negligible in the context of the Caribbean. And so it's a significant opportunity for us to move significantly and in a structured way to change the landscape. What is useful also is that at the regional level, at least there is clear agreement that we need to go in a certain direction. There is such a thing as a CARICOM energy policy, which covers most of the BMCs. There is also a strategic approach being pursued where there are some targets agreed. The question is, how can we move in a direction where we can work more closely in the context of the decisions that have been made at the political level, and as a financing institution, as CDB, seek to make those things materialize. To make those things happen. I think there's a big opportunity there, seeing that we have come so far to the point where we have agreed on some basic things. And this is not insignificant, because the Caribbean region is the third region in the world that has regional targets. And I'm saying with all the challenges we have, it is significant that we can come to that point. The issue is how we can translate that into the kind of implementation. And so I think there is opportunity for a regional approach. It's not without challenges, but some work has been done, and it's for us to really capitalize on those. We need to understand the landscape, understand the issues among the various stakeholders, so that we can better provide information to clarify the issues towards action in a very timely way. Member states have done significantly in terms of their own policy indication, the different instruments they have identified within their national policies to address some of the issues. The report, just to close, I think is useful, and there are many areas there that I think can inform and be used as basis to advance policy in terms of an energy sector policy and strategy in the context of the bank. Obviously, some of these are in the broader context and were being contemplated, but I thought I would have identified a few of those, Dr. Ram, so that the synergies and the integrative approach can be taken. Obviously, the big opportunity is, the big area for addressing is legislative and regulatory framework. And I just want to just back up to this slide just to make one quick comment. that the public sector, the speaker spoke to it before, so I didn't want to spend too much time on it, but the public sector represents a huge opportunity, especially as the gentleman from Mr. Brown from Jamaica mentioned, for the use of instruments like the Energy Services Company utilizing performance contracting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for a very informative presentation. I'd now like to open the floor for any questions, comments that delegates, certainly directors, governors might have, and you can direct questions to the panelists as you see fit. Maybe as we're moving into lunchtime, people are thinking more of, let's see. Okay. China, I see China. Okay.
First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for the very instructive presentation according to their work experiences. Second, I would like to just make a few general comments regarding the green economy and growth. First, as the tourism and the related service industry is the growth pillar of most Caribbean economies, we think that environmental protection is crucial in this region. And also the exploration and the utilization of new energy is a strategic choice to realize the sustainable growth for the Caribbean region. Number two, at the current stage of development, the most important task of many countries in this region is poverty reduction and economic growth. Therefore, green and growth should be complementary each other, and the focus should be long-term sustainable development. At the cost of applying and spreading green technology is relatively high, efficiency is to be emphasized when financing resources are limited. Strategies should be tailored to the specific conditions in the different economies. Technology transfer is one of the keys to the success of the strategies. Therefore, developed countries could make more contributions in this regard, according to their own experience in the past. Number three, with respect to the utilization of new energy, it is important to find projects based on the local climate situation so as to fully tap the capacity potentials. There are huge potentials in the use of solar energy in the Caribbean region. The governments should develop preferential policy and provide the construction of solar power plants, the application of solar energy equipped in buildings that meet the market demand. In the meantime, countries should, from a strategic perspective, promote the use of new energy vehicles. Governments should adopt supporting policies in the development, purchase, and the use of new energy cars to support the industry. Lastly, China has technical and economic advantages in the use and the promotion of solar and wind energies. In this collection, the People's Bank of China, at the window of CDB, is willing to promote communication and cooperation between the CDB members and the Chinese Energy Department and the related enterprises and corporations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any? United Kingdom?
Hi, thank you very much for this. I find it, I don't know much about the technology side, but it sounds to me, by listening to all the presentation, that this is a win-win-win. There's so many advantages in the various new technology, and I'm sure there's going to be more technology changes over the next 10, 20 years. Thomas, I like the presentation where you give a kind of vision of where we'll be in 2025. I think that's really helpful. But I would like to ask each panel member here, what would be the one or maybe two things that you want us to do? What are the major challenges? I mean, Mr. Bissy Williams mentioned regulations, but there are maybe some other issues also as well. And just what do we need to tackle now to make this vision, this kind of reality in 2025 that Thomas talked about? Just to understand, and what is then the role of the CDB, apart from you already outlined some of it, but what would be the key thing for us to really focus on now?
Okay. Thank you, UK. I'll ask Jamaica.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I too would like to thank the presenters for this very instructive presentation. And although I am in the Ministry of Finance and I'm aware that there is a strong need for the reduction of energy costs, I was not as aware as I've become with these presentations. And so I wonder, is there a role for ministries of finance, just as how they have become more aware of climate change and its impact, to be more aware of this type of detail in relation to the hidden costs that we are bearing and the potential that exists for reducing costs to government? Because more than anywhere else in the government, aside from possibly the Cabinet Office, the Ministry of Finance looks across all of the government and can see the potential saving. And so it's likely to be something like a make or buy decision, or some sort of cost effectiveness study with appropriate payback, language that the Ministry of Finance can understand, because I don't think the Ministry of Finance understands KWA and KWH and PV and emissions, lumens, etc. But it understands the language of finance, and it might be necessary to translate this message in a language of finance that a Ministry of Finance that sits at the center and can make appropriate decision can then insert itself in the process. Fortunately for us, we have the DBJ in our portfolio, but it is possible that a Ministry of Energy that falls somewhere else may not be integrating enough with the Ministry of Finance in language that is understood. So I suppose it's a comment and not a question once again, that ministries of finance need to be mainstreamed in the process of energy and cost reduction and the improvement of efficiency, not conservation so much as it is in terms of new technologies and making assessments over a longer term for sustainability. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Jamaica. Maybe what I'll do, I'll ask each of the panelists to, I'm probably going to try to wrap together. Yeah, so.
And I'm sorry, Chair. And so what would your recommendations be for this mainstreaming in the Ministry of Finance?
So what I'm going to do, I'm going to wrap that particular point, Jamaica, together with what China was saying at the end in terms of the sort of the role of government, and I guess here you are speaking more specifically to Ministry of Finance as a conduit for the green economy and renewable energy. Maybe could I ask each of the panelists just to take a stab at this, because I think it's quite an important area, and then we'll come back to address the issues raised by the UK in turn. Joseph, could I ask you to just attempt to answer that first, and then we'll come down the line.
Sure. Thank you so much for the questions. I think they're quite on target, and sometimes the time constraint, with the time constraint, you can't get into some of the details. So one is constrained. But the issue of role of government, I think it is clear that government has a big role to play in terms of changing the landscape going forward. I mean, at the top of the list is the whole question of just access for renewable energy. I mean, that's basic. Where you have a situation where it is not, it doesn't, these generations cannot integrate with the grid or these technologies. By law, I mean, you just can't do, you can't move. There's nothing you can do about that. That is the role of government, really. So, to put it in a nutshell, I always speak in terms of access and price. So somebody has to determine what is an equitable price given your context in terms of the generation cost or energy cost generally. So that is and that is important because any investor needs to know that if I'm going to put my money, I have a clear sense of that it's a fairly stable framework, and I know I can calculate what are my returns over what, or horizons, So that is so basic. But I think to begin with, there are some things that don't necessarily require a lot of legislative work. I mean, if you take energy efficiency, for example, it's just a big opportunity for us just to do it. There is nothing stopping us from just setting some real targets in the public sector and just doing it. Yes, we need to do some capacity work, but there are partners available. We have, approaches that can help us to overcome those hurdles. So I think the energy efficiency opportunity is a big one that we can move on immediately. And once we have the public sector moving, you get some demonstration in that process. You get some learning, some experience in the context of getting the private sector involved also. And you build an industry, because ultimately, for this thing to be sustainable, the market needs to work. You have to have the demand on the supply side and for it to work. On the issue, so that would come back to the question of what is that one single thing. I think the most important action would be for government to ensure that we have the legislative framework that will allow for access and equitable pricing. Obviously, the regulatory component is an important dimension of that. There was a question of Ministry of Finance and Energy. I think we're planning takes place in the region. I find generally it's not done in an integrative way. And that, I think, can address some of the issues, because most of the ministries of energy are aware of the issues with all the capacity limitation. What I think happens is that you have planning taking place by a development or planning agency or entities or bodies, and there is not that integrative approach. That is one way that we could address the issue, to the extent that we try to bring those two together, meaning the finance generally with some of the other sectoral areas. That could make a big difference. Other than that, I think there is need for what I just mentioned, the need for analysis per member state to help government to see the options very clearly. It's one thing to talk about generally what can be done in terms of potential. It's another thing to place before you scenarios that say, if you do this, this is the likely outcome. And give you some risk associated with some of those decisions. So those would be the two things I would say, some more integrated planning, as well as analyses that can give you very clear options that decisions can be made upon. Thanks.
I think most of the topics Joseph just touched, but just even I'm running the risk to repeat. We see clearly the need to turn existing energy policies into ruling legislation. We see now in most of the Caribbean countries they have a written energy policy that guides what needs to be done in this, but it still lacks to turn this energy policy, which is written on paper, to put into reliable, enforceable law. What we see, or in other words, investment will only be happen by private investors or by utilities if there's a reliable, foreseeable framework. That's why also utilities call for regulation, even it might be not as an advantage for them. They can act and plan for the next 10 to 20 years only if they know exactly what will they be allowed to do and what the governments intend to do. They will lose, most of them, they will lose most probably the monopoly on generation for renewable energies. We see this in several countries, most visible in St. Lucia, but also in Grenada. In other countries, we have already, IPPs are allowed, but it's important to have this framework written down in enforceable laws. If this happened and we have a clear regulatory framework, then we will see utilities investing, especially if they are obliged to do so. At the moment, none of the utilities are obliged to use renewable energies or to promote energy efficiency. And they do what is their usual behavior. They just behave market conform. As long as they are not obliged by law to come up with a certain minimum percentage of renewable energy or support energy efficiency, they will not do it. Why should they? About 50% of the utilities are privately owned, about 50% in the region are government owned. And they have the right to realize the rate of return, and that's what they are doing as long as they are not obliged to do so. So we see clearly a role for the governments to complete the energy reforms that started with formulating the energy policy, and now the time is overdue to turn this into ruling legislation. When it comes quickly to what finance ministers can do, I think what Joseph mentioned as well, there's a clear need to have a more intensive communication maybe between the Minister of Energy and Finance, because at the end of the day, the Minister of Finance are usually the one who approve when it's about taking a credit for a investment, public investment in energy. Take an example, we suggested together with the CDB the investment in a small hydro in Dominica, and we had a talk with the Secretary of the Minister of Finance, and it's clearly they will have the say whether or not. So that means the national priorities needs clearly to be formulated, and if energy investments are on this priority lists, the Ministries of Energy should talk to the Ministry of Finance how this can be done. And again, the rule of the CDB, of course, I mean, we are of the opinion that financing as such is not the problem, but access to financing and make it bankable, that is a problem. I think their donors are willing to finance projects as long as they are bankable, they are reliable, they contribute to the national objectives. But again, if the legal framework is not right, it will not happen. Thank you.
Mr. William.
I have to agree entirely with what he said. Now, Barbados has moved rapidly to implement legislation, and the government is very forward-thinking in this respect. But together with legislation, there needs to be all the details that will allow it to be implemented need to be put in place. There are lots of little things that come after something is legislated. Conditions that enable you to enforce the legislation. That has not been completed yet. You asked what the CDB could do. Well, the CDB could start by providing reasonably priced finance for the governments of the Caribbean to turn all government buildings and government consumption of energy to move it towards the use of renewable energy. That would be a great step forward. For example, the water authorities could be provide finance to enable the water authorities to implement a green policy. And all the government buildings could carry PV, and in 5 years' time, the electricity would be virtually free. So it's finance is the in my opinion is a critical thing, but it must be accessible. The private sector can hardly access any finance from the CDB. So my view is that should go to government to enable governments to implement the green installations. And apart from that, these gentlemen have covered the legislation. Is absolute. Our experience with trying to finance alternative energy through export the United States and so on is the first question they ask you is, has the legislation been put in place? What are the conditions? Are they long-term? These are things that are absolutely essential. You have to have long-term stated policy on what you're going to be paid for the power over a long period of time. And another thing is the utilities are allowed, if a guy doesn't pay his bill, to disconnect his service. The providers of alternative energy should be allowed the same option. If you put like for example, our company would like, we are so familiar with the amount of energy that can be generated by various sources that we are willing to guarantee the output when we install something. The biggest problem, the biggest deterrent is, suppose you put a system on a business and the business doesn't pay you. What do? This is something that needs to be legislated, in my opinion, to give the suppliers of the alternative energy the right to install equipment that you could disconnect the service. Otherwise, it's a real problem for the private sector. I think that's about it as far as for me.
Thank you.
I feel like I have the most difficult task after these three gentlemen just answered the question. But I would echo what was said about the financing, which is necessary, as well as the legislative. But I'd just like to add, in response to the Ministry of Finance adopting energy efficiency, I think if a demonstration project was done at a Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Finance was able to save themselves, then all the other government entities that they're managing, I think they will enforce that energy efficiency or renewable energy is done at those specific entities, because it is their responsibility to manage budgets. That's one. Second thing, I think whatever procurement procedures, guided by the planning ministry in hiring contractors or suppliers, I think those procedures should facilitate the selection of projects that will provide the most savings and not necessarily the ones that are cheapest. It may cost more, but life cycle cost, I think, is what is most important. And whatever procurement procedures are in place should facilitate that. And I would say, finally, an issue that suppliers have aired is that if you are to do a project at the ministry, the ministries save 30%. The following year, their budget is cut by that 30%. And that in itself is something that doesn't create a sustainable environment. If the ministry's role is to manage the budget, so maybe it can be cut by the 10%, but the remaining 20% should be used to either pay for the services over time or can be used to do other activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, panelists. Now, we're unfortunately now we have run out of time, so I need to actually bring this discussion to a close. I know there was one question that someone wanted to ask from the floor, but unfortunately the closing ceremony is due to actually begin here at 12:30. So I need to actually, unfortunately, close this seminar off. I'd just like to say from the panel presentations, it's quite evident that renewable energy is cost effective and can be a game changer for the development paradigm within the Caribbean, as Mr. Williams said earlier. There needs to be clear regulatory environment for the promotion of renewable energy. That is critical, and there are some areas where, of course, we realize that financing is necessary, and there is a certain role that we've seen now for the Caribbean Development Bank, and certainly for other IFIs in the region could play. It sounds to me as well that the private sector is willing to take the lead, if, of course, they do have that correct regulatory environment in which to operate. And I think for us here, as many policymakers and decision makers are gathered within this room, we need to actually take note of that and go back to our capitals and report on that, certainly to our ministries of finance. So let me take this opportunity once again to thank all of our panelists for traveling from some distance to get here to Guyana and to be present with us and to share with us all of their knowledge on renewable energy and how we could transition to a green economy. Please give them a round of applause.